I want to look at the famous lost decade of Japan. Remember, I wanted to look at Japan and what happened to the UK in the early 1900s. And they are kind of going to be my frameworks for what is about to happen. The idea being, that Japan has entered low growth as an aging population. That's happening. The thesis is that's happening in Europe. That's going to happen in the US as well. So, there were projections. Expected growth rates are not going to be high. So days of 4, 5, 6% growth are history. So that's the way I'm looking at things. So Japan was the first case to consider, to get some information, some data about that. So just typed in Japan lost decade into Google, and you get a long list. So I'm just gonna go through a couple of them. I'll have the URLs in the description below the video, though you can search yourself, So here, this is from The Economist. Japan is now 40 to 50% below what the world in 1991 would have estimated their GDP to be in 2012. I think that's a nice way of putting it, so just to give a context. So, at the moment, we've got all these projections. I'm talking about, growth is going to be this. It sounds very confident and certain. If I was recording this in 1990, I'd be expecting Japan to surge ahead, and I'd be very enthusiastic about the Japanese business model, the economy, the future. And it didn't turn out that way. Was there anything? So yeah, this compares various things. I'm just going to keep moving. So, lessons from Japan's real estate crisis. So this is the kind of thing that I wanted to go over. I mean, I know, that essentially you had this huge real estate bubble in Japan, which, to be fair, I'm in Ireland, and we just had one of those in 2007. When suddenly people were going, a standard house, a regular house, for not for millionaires, was now costing $1 million. So everyone knew it was crazy, but you have to have somewhere to stay, and banks were more than happy to lend you that money. And so it kept going. So in fact, in Japan, they ended up having banks giving out multi-generational mortgages, because that's the only way you could really make things add up. So what does this one say? Lessons from. Suffer from both a credit crunch and a liquidity trap. Japan's lost decade. the Bank of Japan's interest rate mistakes. The thing also is that, you know, anyone can comment, and it's very easy to be smug and condescending and say, oh well, they did this wrong, that's what it's because they did this wrong, that's why this happened. We'll see. Credit crunch conclusions, that's all I really want. Clearly, deflation causes a lot of problems. When asset prices are falling, household investors hoard cash because cash will be worth more tomorrow than it is today. The problem is that reinflating the economy isn't easy, especially when banks are unwilling to lend. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, so I don't know. I might flick through this again more later. I don't know whether there's anything no real one-line summary killer statement there. Stanford economist find lessons for US and Japan from Japan's lost decade. That's closer to the kind of thing I wanted to know. You know, I mean, have we actually learnt? Have we figured out what happened in Japan? Will we be able to avoid what happened? Again, I'll zoom. Okay. So what did it say? Risky bank lending. Well, there's always risky bank lending in booms. Drastic change. Unfortunately, some European nations seem to be following Japan's lead. In France, Italy and Spain, bank recapitulation or recapitalization, Freudian slip perhaps, has been delayed, and the structural reforms have been slow. Without drastic changes, they are likely to follow Japan's path to long economic stagnation. So this is, I like the fact it is written by what looks like Japanese authors. I mean, they would more be familiar with the situation. The problems that held back Japan seem to be less serious in the US. Employment protection is low in the US, and the labour market shows high mobility. The regulatory advantage for incumbent firms is smaller than in Europe or Japan. So, okay, so then that is encouraging, or so that means I should be more bullish the US. The US and Germany are in a bit better economic shape, partly due to the fact that they did undertake structural reform sooner rather than later. Okay. I want to keep going, but still 5 years after the failure of Lehman Brothers investment bank left the world's financial markets in chaos, the US and Europe are not yet back to what had looked normal before the crisis, which does seem to be the case. In the years leading up to the financial crisis, the recent US growth was fueled by consumption boom from rapid housing price increase and rising debt levels. Yeah. In a broad sense, the US economy before the crisis was similar to the Japanese or Spanish economies. Adding in that in Japan, the speculative investment boom in the late 1980s masked structural problems. Okay. So from that, my takeaway would be, you know, the US did seem to have done the right thing more, and so shouldn't fall into the Japanese lost decade kind of scenario. And the demographics are better in the US as well, so this makes me more bullish. US. Yes, Japan lost a decade, so did US. So this is a Bloomberg article. Here's a myth. Japan is now in its third lost decade. Here's another myth. Japan never lost any decades at all. Okay, so, and the URLs for all these are in the description below the video. Real GDP per working age resident. So that's interesting, since, you know, if we were supposed to be having repeated lost decades in Japan, that doesn't seem to be evident from this graph. I mean, this is 1993. I thought the lost decade, the market peaked about at the end of 89. So 1990 to 2000 should have been the lost decade, which, to be fair, is the case. I mean, if it began in 1993, after 10 years, Japan only increased by 10%, while the Europe and the US increased by 20%, hence the lost decade. But in the next 10 years, Europe and the US, basically, so the US went up 35%, Europe by 30%, just under. But in the end, Japan was above 30%. So, yes, the first 10 years were slow for Japan, but since it has caught up. So, the net result is Japan is fine. I mean, there doesn't seem to be any real lost decade there. That means so far Japan is winning the Great Recession recovery. Basically, since Japan had the crash, their lost decade, though that's dubious now from this, their banks were not happy-go-lucky in lending, and so Japan basically avoided the Great Recession. So 2007-8, when Europe and the US got whacked, Japan was fine. So in the end, Japan just kept moving, and they're at the same place as Europe and the US after, the last decade. The second thing you can see in the graph is that Japan did better than the US and about the same as Europe from 2002 to okay. So no, that's, I didn't know that. That is pretty interesting, that the fact that the data shows that the lost decade effect has basically gone. Finally, so this explaining Japan's recession. This has various economic theories. I'll just go, again, you can go through this yourself. I'll just finish up with the conclusion. The Austrian theory, like the Keynesian and monetarist theories, can give a reason for the start of the Japanese recession. Unlike the other schools, the Austrian policy recommendation of laissez-faire has not been tried. One prediction that Austrian business cycle theory provides has been accurate. The industries in the earliest stages of production have had the worst growth rates throughout the entire decade. Japan has experienced an Austrian business cycle. The initial boom was created by a central bank-induced monetary expansion. Because of the repeated interventions, the economy has not recovered. The greatest malinvestment took place in capital-intensive industries in the earlier stages of production. For Japan's economy to recover, the government must stop intervening in the economy and allow the market process to realign the structure of production to match consumer preferences. That gives us something to think about. So as I said, next I want to have a similar quick look at what happened in the early 1900s when the UK was the world's largest economy, but it, with multiple wars, ending up owing lots of money, and being stuck with having the reserve currency, and so not being able to control its exchange rates and various other factors. What happened to the UK economy? After that's done, we've done a lot of broad waffle and reviews of things. Then we zoom in more and look for opportunities to make money. Till then.